What if the past wasn't as primitive as we were taught? What if beneath layers of sand, ice, and water lie fragments of history that challenge everything we thought we knew about time, survival, and human potential? The story begins not with a single discovery, but with a pattern, a series of moments where the ground gave up secrets that didn't fit the script. They weren't conspiracy theories. They were real findings. Objects, bodies, structures, machines, each one quietly contradicting decades of education. Not loudly, not all at once, but in subtle, haunting ways. Like forgotten pages from a much older book being reassembled piece by piece. For centuries, science and history have given us comfort through order. Human evolution, the rise of civilization, the steady climb of knowledge from darkness into light. It's a story we've memorized. But what happens when reality doesn't align with the chapters? When a perfectly preserved sailor, frozen in Arctic ice for over a century, reveals internal organs that should have decayed, or bones that tell of survival in conditions thought lethal within days? These are not anomalies. They're lessons in humility. In South Africa, a fish pulled from the sea in 1938 shattered the timeline of extinction. It had been marked as gone for 66 million years. Textbooks said so. But there it was, alive and gasping, unchanged, unbothered by our certainty. And just like that, the fossil record became less a record and more a guess. In the Andes, skulls with surgical holes tell stories of ancient hands guided not by crude trial and error, but by practiced precision. Surgeries performed with success rates modern doctors didn't match until centuries later. No textbooks prepared us for that. We'd been taught that ancient medicine was barely above superstition. Yet, here was clean evidence of advanced technique, of understanding that didn't fit the arc of progress. It wasn't just biology and medicine. Stone pillars carved 11,500 years ago in the hills of Turkey defied the timeline of civilization itself. Who taught hunter-gatherers to quarry, transport, and align stones weighing 20 tons? Who gave them the organizational will to build temples before they even planted crops? We don't know. But they did it. And beneath the waters off India, a ghost city lies 120 feet deep, with walls, streets, and tools dating back 9,500 years. If true, it predates Mesopotamia and Egypt by millennia. Civilizations were never meant to exist back then, at least not in the stories we tell in classrooms. Yet there it rests, untouched by time, waiting for us to notice. This isn't about rewriting history with wild speculation. It's about the importance of listening, of recognizing that knowledge isn't a fortress but a field. Open, incomplete, ever-growing. These discoveries don't demand we throw out science. They ask us to respect the vastness of what we don't yet understand. In this series, we'll walk through 13 cases, each one a window into something forgotten, overlooked, or denied. We won't chase conspiracies, we'll follow the evidence. We'll ask what it means when certainty breaks, when assumptions falter, and when truth hides in the places we've stopped looking. This isn't a documentary about the past. It's a meditation on how we teach, what we believe, and the quiet resilience of mystery. Because maybe the most important thing these discoveries reveal isn't about ancient cities or lost technologies, but about us. Our need to simplify, to fit everything into neat progressions, our resistance to uncertainty, and our deep, enduring hunger to know where we come from. Welcome to the search for forgotten knowledge, a journey through the cracks in the timeline, the whispers of what once was, and the enduring question, what if the past was far more advanced than we've ever imagined? It began with ice, a body locked in silence, preserved by a frozen world that had forgotten him. In 1984, on a remote Arctic island, a research team stumbled upon something that shouldn't have existed. Beneath the snow, beneath the frost, they found the remains of a sailor from the doomed 1845 Franklin expedition, perfectly preserved, his face intact, his uniform still recognizable. The kind of discovery that halts breath, not because of fear, but because of contradiction. History had always painted the expedition's end in broad, final strokes. 129 men abandoned by their ships, swallowed by the ice, perishing within months, in the cold, starved, and lost. It was a tale of tragedy, yes, but also a cautionary one. The ultimate lesson in the limits of human endurance in hostile environments. Textbooks echoed it. Survival training referenced it. But here was a man whose very body defied the story. Forensic analysis uncovered something astonishing. He had lived not for weeks, but years after the expedition was presumed lost. His stomach contained food. His tissues showed signs of long-term adaptation. He had endured the Arctic in ways science said was impossible, and it wasn't just him. Over time, more bodies would be found. More evidence of extended survival. The pattern was undeniable. But what disturbed researchers more was what lay inside. His organs, preserved as if frozen moments after life, bore signs of slow poisoning. High levels of lead, likely from poorly sealed canned food. There were indicators of scurvy, of starvation, but there was something else too. Marks, residues, anatomical clues that hinted at a darker adaptation. Cannibalism. It was not spoken of easily. It wasn't the horror of it that shocked researchers. It was the implications. These were acts of survival, not madness. Cold logic, not cruelty. The Arctic. Dick once thought a realm where death came swiftly was now a stage for a different kind of endurance, one that rewrote the rules of survival. The story shifted from tragedy to endurance, from limits to resilience. When the findings were published, institutions pushed back. Professors questioned the analysis. Survival experts cited training manuals. The science, they insisted, didn't match. But bodies don't lie. And when faced with undeniable evidence, the story of what humans are capable of began to change. The textbooks were revised. This discovery didn't just rewrite one expedition's fate. It challenged how we think about extremes, what we believe about our own fragility. It opened the door to a larger question: how many other impossibilities are hidden beneath assumptions? The frozen sailor did not survive for the history books. He survived for his crew, for himself. But his stillness now speaks to us louder than words, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that the line between life and death, possible and impossible, isn't as clear as we once believed. And that sometimes survival is a quiet defiance against the limits we think define us. So we begin here, in the ice, with a man who was supposed to die quickly, and instead lived long enough to leave behind the proof that we were wrong. Because if the Arctic wasn't the end, then maybe, for all we know, it was only the beginning. The sea gave up its secret with the slap of a fish on a wooden deck. It was 1938, just off the coast of South Africa. A local trawler hauled in a creature no one on board recognized. Its scales shimmered with prehistoric texture, its body thick and ancient. The fish was sent to a museum curator, who sensed immediately this was not an ordinary catch. She sent a sketch to a leading ichthyologist. The reply came quickly. Disbelief. It was a coelacanth, a fish that should have been extinct for 66 million years. According to everything taught in classrooms around the world, this species had vanished with the dinosaurs. Fossils of the coelacanth were iconic in evolutionary charts, placed carefully on the tree of life as a transitional link between sea creatures and landwalkers. It had been a star witness in the story of evolution, a chapter that supposedly had long ended. But this fish, very much alive, rewrote that chapter in a single moment. Paleontology had painted extinction as final. When species vanished from the fossil record, it was seen as definitive. The coelacanth's reappearance shattered that certainty. It introduced a new term into the scientific lexicon: Lazarus taxa, creatures believed extinct that suddenly re-emerged, not from fossils, but from the present. More than a curiosity, the coelacanth revealed gaps in what we thought was complete. For 66 million years, it had swum in deep, quiet waters, unchanging, unrecorded. Its body bore near-perfect resemblance to its fossil ancestors. It had not evolved in the way we expect organisms to do over such vast time spans. It had found a niche and remained. Evolution, we're told, is constant adaptation. The coelacanth whispered a different truth. Sometimes perfection needs no change. The implications spread quickly through biology and paleontology. If one species had survived undetected for tens of millions of years, how many others might linger in forgotten corners of the world? If the fossil record had missed this, what else had it missed? The coelacanth didn't just shake the tree of life. It shook our trust in how we build its branches. Students had memorized the extinction of the coelacanth as fact. Exams were passed on that knowledge. And yet there it was, alive and drifting. This wasn't about a single fish. It was about the nature of scientific certainty. How much we take as settled when the evidence is still incomplete, and how fragile our understanding becomes when we mistake absence for proof. In the quiet depths, the coelacanth had waited, unaware that it had been declared impossible. Its survival wasn't just a biological oddity, it was a philosophical one. What other truths, assumed gone, might simply be hiding beyond our reach? The ocean is vast, and sometimes what we consider ancient history is still swimming just beneath the surface. In a land scorched by sun and time, the ground remembered something we had forgotten. It was 1976, in the volcanic plains of Laetoli, Tanzania. A team of paleontologists brushed away layers of hardened ash, expecting traces of the past. What they uncovered were footprints, not animal, not ape, human, or something close enough to make the distinction unsettling. Dated to 3.6 million years ago, these footprints defied every lesson taught in anthropology classrooms. They weren't scattered or erratic. They moved with purpose. A heel strike, an arch, a forward toe push. Every element of a modern walking gait was there, perfectly preserved in ancient ash. But the problem was this. According to every evolutionary timeline, humans couldn't walk like that 3.6 million years ago. At that point in our story, we were still supposed to be transitioning from the trees. Our ancestors, Australopithecus afarensis, were described as semi-upright, with curved feet and splayed toes for climbing. The idea that any hominin could stride confidently across soft ground, upright and balanced, so far back in time, was not just unexpected. It was forbidden by the very structure of the evolutionary narrative, and yet the footprints walked right through it. The trail showed more than one individual, adults, possibly a child, moving together side by side. There was rhythm in the impressions, familiarity, humanity. These weren't creatures fumbling toward uprightness. They walked like us. Anthropologists reeled. Some questioned the dating. Others suggested the prints were from a different species entirely, one not yet discovered, or that perhaps erosion had shaped the tracks into something misleading. But the evidence held. The ash layer was confirmed. The stride and anatomy matched modern biomechanics. And so, a quiet revolution began. The footprints didn't just shift a few dates in textbooks. They cracked the illusion of linear progress. The story of human evolution had been drawn like a staircase, each step a little more upright, a little more human. But this was a leap, a reminder that nature doesn't always follow our tidy diagrams. What disturbed many wasn't the discovery itself, but what it suggested about how knowledge is taught. In lecture halls, students were told when humans became bipedal. when feet changed, when minds followed. But those timelines weren't presented as evolving theories. They were taught as truths. And yet, here were footprints in the ash, saying something very different. This scene, imprinted in volcanic dust, remains one of the clearest reminders that science, though built on evidence, is also shaped by interpretation. And interpretations are vulnerable to the expectations of the present. So what else lies waiting? What other clues have we stepped over because they didn't fit? Sometimes it's not the fossils that challenge our beliefs. It's the footprints we leave behind. And in the ancient soil of Tanzania, someone walked far ahead of the story we thought we were telling. In a canyon veiled by mist and eucalyptus, a grove of ghosts stood quietly breathing. It was 1994 in Australia's Blue Mountains when a park ranger ventured into a rarely explored gully. There, among the ferns and cliffs, he saw something that shouldn't have existed. Tall conifers with strange bark and primeval shapes. He took a clipping and sent it to botanists. Their reaction was disbelief. These were Wollemi pines, trees thought to have been extinct for over 2 million years. Before that day, they lived only in fossilized form, pressed into stone and memory. Paleobotany students memorized their disappearance as fact. Their extinction had been a textbook example of species lost due to ancient climate change. But now, that narrative collapsed into the soft soil of a hidden canyon. This wasn't just a living relative. DNA testing confirmed it. These were the exact same species as the ancient fossils, not cousins, not mutations, survivors. The implications spread quickly through botanical science. Extinction, it turned out, wasn't always final. It could be an illusion, a gap in visibility, not existence. For 2 million years, while the world turned and scientists wrote them off, the Wollemi pines endured in silence. And the irony? The grove wasn't in some remote, inaccessible wilderness. It was in a national park a few hours from Sydney. Not a lost jungle, not a forgotten island, just a quiet place no one had thought to look closely enough. What did this say about our certainty? How many other species, declared extinct with academic confidence, were still alive in the overlooked margins? The Wollemi pine forced a reckoning. Botany courses had to soften their tone. Extinction events, once presented as absolute, were reclassified as assumptions based on absence. A sobering reminder that science, while rigorous, is still shaped by what we can see, and often by what we fail to see. There was something deeply poetic in the discovery, too. A living fossil standing unchanged in a world that had changed so much. The trees, with their knobby bark and dark green needles, became symbols of endurance, of secrecy, of nature's quiet defiance. They had survived ice ages, fires, and the rise and fall of empires. They had survived being forgotten. What else might still be out there, not in far-off galaxies or distant epochs, but here, in the folds of the familiar, hidden not by distance, but by the limits of our looking? Sometimes a discovery isn't just about what we find. It's about what we thought we had lost, and the humility to admit we never knew it all. In the hush of that canyon, the past was still alive, swaying in the wind. It was as if a city had been paused, then buried beneath the waves. In 2000, off the coast of India, near the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans picked up something unusual on the ocean floor. Geometric shapes, patterns, structures too regular to be natural. Marine archaeologists dove into murky depths and found stone blocks, arranged roads, and what appeared to be walls and foundations, 120 feet below the surface. Among the debris, they retrieved artifacts, tools, pottery shards. Carbon dating placed them at around 9,500 years old. This didn't fit. According to established history, human civilization hadn't yet begun at that time. The first cities were supposed to have emerged in Mesopotamia or Egypt some 5,000 years ago. Before that, humans were assumed to be simple, nomadic hunter-gatherers. Building cities, let alone stone cities, was not part of the story. And yet, here it was, a sunken urban layout from an era we associate with tents and spears. Initial skepticism was fierce. Critics said the structures must be natural formations. The dating must be contaminated. Some scholars dismissed the entire find as a misinterpretation, but further analysis found cut marks on the stones. Tool impressions. Cultural layers buried in silt. It wasn't just a pile of rocks, it was intentional. The location deepened the mystery. This city would have been built during the Ice Age, when sea levels were dramatically lower. That meant it had been submerged by the gradual melting of glaciers, drowned slowly by a rising ocean. If the dating held true, this wasn't just a city. It was one of the oldest known to humanity, twice as old as the pyramids. The implications were immense. Was it a lost civilization, a precursor culture that left no other trace? Or was it evidence that human societal development was far more complex and far earlier than we've taught? History textbooks didn't know what to do with it. Most didn't mention it. Courses in ancient history stayed silent. To include the site would mean re-evaluating the entire framework of human progress. But beneath the surface, the story remains. This wasn't just about underwater ruins. It was about how fragile our historical timeline is, how quickly it can be disrupted by a single forgotten place, and how much of our planet's past might lie not in deserts or tombs, but beneath the waves, covered by time and tide. The ocean is vast, and its silence holds more than salt water. It holds memory. Perhaps the story of civilization didn't begin where we think it did. Perhaps it began earlier, deeper, and is still waiting to be found, stone by ancient stone. The desert gave up its dead, but what they revealed was life. In 2013, in the highlands of Peru, archaeologists were excavating a burial site thought to be over 3,000 years old. What they found were human skulls, dozens of them. But these weren't signs of violence or trauma. They were marked by something far more precise: surgery. Each skull showed evidence of trepanation, the deliberate removal of a section of the skull bone. Not only that, but many showed clear signs of healing. These weren't victims, they were survivors. It was a revelation that challenged the very foundation of medical history. In classrooms around the world, students are taught that ancient medicine was primitive, lacking real knowledge of anatomy, hygiene, or technique. Early physicians were said to rely on ritual and guesswork. Surgery, especially brain surgery, was presumed almost universally fatal before the advent of modern medicine. And yet here was proof that thousands of years ago, surgeons in ancient Peru not only operated on the skull, but did so with remarkable success. The survival rate, based on bone regrowth, was over 80%, a figure that surpasses the survival rate of similar cranial surgeries performed during the American Civil War. Nearly 3,000 years later, the skulls told a clear story. The holes were made in consistent locations, avoiding major blood vessels and sensitive regions. The edges were smooth. Infection, somehow, had been avoided in most cases. Some skulls even showed signs of multiple surgeries across years, indicating patients lived long enough to need and survive additional procedures. How had they done it? Researchers theorized that ancient surgeons may have used sharpened obsidian tools, that they cleaned wounds with natural antiseptics, perhaps derived from local plants. That knowledge was passed down carefully, not as superstition, but as practical science refined through experience. What these skulls revealed wasn't magic. It was mastery. The discovery forced medical historians to rewrite parts of the story, to acknowledge that in some ways, ancient practitioners outperformed their modern counterparts, not in technology, but in outcomes. And once again, we were reminded of a recurring theme. The arrogance of assuming that ancient equals inferior. These surgeons didn't have electricity or microscopes, but they had understanding. They had observation. They had success. The skulls rest now in museum drawers, carefully catalogued, silent testaments to a truth we are only beginning to accept, that the past may not be as dark as we were taught, that intelligence is not the same as advancement, and that what we dismiss as primitive may, in fact, be profound. In the Andean soil, medicine lived long before we gave it credit, and its legacy is carved quietly into bone. It rose from the earth like something from myth. Massive stone circles, carved pillars, and ancient silence. In 2007, at a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered structures that shouldn't have existed. Towering T-shaped pillars arranged in concentric rings. Some weighed more than 20 tons. Others were covered in elaborate carvings, foxes, birds, snakes, symbols whose meanings were long forgotten. Carbon dating placed the site at around 11,500 years old. That date shattered expectations, because at that point in human history, we weren't supposed to be capable of building anything so monumental. According to the academic timeline, agriculture hadn't been invented yet. Humans were still nomadic hunter-gatherers. Civilization, as we understood it, was thousands of years in the future. But there it stood, an ancient temple complex built by people without cities, without farming, without metallurgy or writing, yet with vision and organization. The pillars weren't crude. They were precise, balanced, aligned. The carvings weren't random. They showed artistic intention and symbolic depth. These weren't the scattered stones of a wandering tribe. They were the bones of belief, purpose, and structure. Göbekli Tepe didn't just predate agriculture. It may have inspired it. Some researchers now propose that the desire to gather, to build, to worship together may have driven humans to settle. That farming was developed not as the start of civilization, but as a response to it. The story we thought we knew, first we farmed, then we built, may have happened in reverse. The discovery forced archaeologists to rethink their foundational assumptions. For decades, students were taught a linear progression: tools, then farming, then cities, then temples. But this site suggested the spiritual impulse came first. Why would nomads build such a place? How did they organize the labor? What compelled them to lift stone and shape space long before politics, kings, or even permanent homes? There were no easy answers. Göbekli Tepe revealed something even deeper than age. It revealed complexity, imagination, the presence of social and spiritual structures we had long denied to early humans. And then there was the mystery of its burial. At some point, long after it was built, the people who used it deliberately buried the entire complex under tons of earth. Not by accident, not by erosion, intentionally, as if to protect it or to leave it behind. What knowledge did they carry? What purpose did these stones serve? And why did they decide to hide it all away? Standing among the pillars, modern researchers are left with more questions than conclusions, and perhaps that's the point. Göbekli Tepe doesn't just challenge our timeline, it challenges our pride. It reminds us that intelligence, faith, and ambition are not modern inventions. They have always been part of us. Buried beneath the soil was not just a temple. It was evidence that humanity's story is older, deeper, and more mysterious than we've dared to believe. In the flicker of old parchment, a coastline appeared where none should be. It was 1992 when a group of researchers began re-examining medieval maps. Among them was the Piri Reis map, a fragment from 1513 created by an Ottoman admiral, compiled from even older sources. What made the map so extraordinary wasn't just its age, but what it seemed to show. There, at the bottom edge of the map, was a rough but unmistakable outline of Antarctica. not as a frozen wasteland, but as an ice-free coastline. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. And even then, it was under a mile of ice. Modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar didn't reveal its true land contours until the 1950s. Yet the map showed them 5 centuries earlier. According to every historical teaching, this was impossible. Early cartographers, we're told, relied on guesswork, trade routes, and hearsay. Their maps were often more imaginative than accurate. But when experts compared the Peary Race map's rendering of Antarctica's subglacial coast with modern data, the match was striking. Bays, inlets, and mountain ranges aligned. How could this be? Theories emerged. Some suggested the map was copied from ancient charts passed down from lost civilizations, mariners who explored the globe long before recorded history. If so, the original source would have to date back over 6,000 years, before the last ice age fully covered Antarctica with ice. Others dismissed the resemblance as coincidence, or argued the coastline wasn't Antarctica at all. But the more closely the data was analyzed, the harder it became to deny the precision. If these maps were accurate, then our understanding of early navigation was fundamentally flawed. Ancient people would have needed advanced knowledge of latitude, trigonometry, and seafaring, skills supposedly invented thousands of years later. And this wasn't an isolated case. Other old maps, like the Orontius Phineus map and the Boache map, showed similar features, repeating the pattern. The response from academic circles was cautious. Some insisted that the maps must have been misinterpreted. Others quietly began re-evaluating what early civilizations might have known about the world. Because if these maps were even partially correct, they suggested something radical, that humanity once possessed knowledge of the globe we no longer understand. The Peary Race map became more than a curiosity. It became a symbol of the gaps in our story, a fragment of memory too detailed to dismiss and too disruptive to fully embrace. Perhaps the most haunting question wasn't how the map was made, but what it meant that it had been forgotten. If ancient explorers once charted Antarctica, what else did they know? What other coastlines have we lost? Not to time, but to solitude. The past is not just etched in stone or buried in ruins. Sometimes it's drawn in ink, waiting centuries to be seen again. And when we finally look, the shape of the world begins to change. It looked like a relic of daily life, a clay jar, simple and unassuming. In 1936, during an excavation near Baghdad, archaeologists unearthed a set of ancient vessels buried in the ruins of a Parthian village. At first glance, they resembled storage jars, but inside they found something odd: copper cylinders, iron rods, and traces of acidic residue. It didn't take long for someone to ask an impossible question. Could this be a battery? To test the theory, researchers filled replicas with vinegar, inserted the rods, and connected wires. The result was unmistakable: an electrical current just over 1 volt. That single spark contradicted centuries of assumed history. According to every physics textbook, electricity was discovered in the 18th century, refined in the 19th, and harnessed in the modern age. Before that, there were no circuits, no conductors, no comprehension of current. Electricity belonged to Franklin, Faraday, and Edison, not to ancient Mesopotamia. And yet, the so-called Baghdad battery worked. More than a dozen similar jars were found in the region, all dating back to around 200 BCE. Their internal components followed the same design. This wasn't coincidence. It was replication, intentional, functional, and forgotten. Theories abounded. Some proposed they were used for electroplating, coating objects with thin layers of precious metals. Others suggested they powered religious artifacts or created static shocks for ritual. There were even ancient texts referencing glowing objects in temples, lamps that burned without fire. Skeptics argued the jars had another purpose. Maybe they held scrolls. Maybe the design was incidental, but the consistent presence of metal components and acidic residue told another story. What stunned researchers most wasn't just that the devices could produce electricity. It was the implications of that knowledge disappearing for nearly 2,000 years. No records described their function. No written instructions survived. Whatever purpose they served, it was lost, buried by time, conquest, or disinterest. And when electricity was rediscovered in the modern age, it came with fanfare, as if it had never been known before. The Baghdad battery reveals something unsettling about the human story. Knowledge is not always cumulative. It can be gained, forgotten, then found again. Our trajectory is not a straight line. It's a series of rediscoveries, peaks and valleys shaped by memory and amnesia. What else have we lost? What insights were held in hands long turned to dust, only to be uncovered in pieces centuries later? A clay jar, a spark, a reminder that our ancestors may have understood more than we've imagined, and that the lights we think we invented may have once flickered in the ancient dark. It was green with age and encrusted by centuries beneath the sea. In 1900, off the coast of the Greek island Antikythera, sponge divers discovered a shipwreck from ancient times. Amid the bronze statues and pottery, they found a lump of corroded metal, unremarkable at first. But years later, when X-rays peered inside, they revealed something astonishing. Gears, dozens of them. This was no simple artifact. It was a machine, a mechanism. Careful analysis showed it was capable of astronomical calculations, tracking the sun, moon, planetary positions, even predicting eclipses and Olympic cycles. It came to be known as the Antikythera mechanism, and it should not have existed. According to every historical timeline, devices of this complexity weren't developed until the Renaissance, 1,500 years later. Mechanical clocks, differential gearing, precision engineering, all those belong to the modern world. Yet this ancient object, dating from around 100 BCE, held them all. It was a computer, built in the ancient world. Scholars were stunned. The device featured at least 30 bronze gears arranged in a layered, compact design. Turning a crank would set the gears in motion, computing celestial movements with startling accuracy. It even accounted for the elliptical orbits of the moon. The craftsmanship was beyond what historians believed ancient Greeks capable of. Some components were so fine they resembled those in 18th century watchmaking. And yet this mechanism predated the invention of timepieces by centuries. Where had this knowledge come from? And why was it lost? There were no other devices like it. No blueprints, no documentation, nothing to explain how such engineering had developed, or how it vanished so thoroughly from the historical record. The Antikythera mechanism stood as a lonely genius from the past, a technological peak with no known mountain below it. It forced historians to rethink the nature of invention. The idea that technological progress is linear, primitive to advanced, was exposed as fragile. Here was proof that ancient minds had achieved levels of sophistication thought impossible. Why didn't this technology spread? Why wasn't it built upon, shared, replicated? One theory suggests political collapse, war, empire, destruction. Another proposes that only a few elite craftsmen knew how to make it, and their knowledge died with them. But perhaps the deeper reason is simpler. History is fragile. What we know is shaped not only by what was created, but by what survives, and what survives is often a matter of chance. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't preserved in a museum. It sank with a ship. It was rediscovered only by accident. Had it gone down in a deeper sea or corroded more completely, we might never have known such genius existed at all. How many other masterpieces have been lost? How many revolutions of knowledge were drowned, burned, or melted down for parts? This single device reminds us that the ancient world was not simple. It was brilliant. And sometimes history isn't a story of progress. It's a story of rediscovery. Buried in bronze beneath the sea, the past had built a machine to mark the heavens. And for 1,000 years, no one remembered how. The stones were carved by hands we didn't expect, small ones. In 2007, a team excavating near Göbekli Tepe in Turkey made an unusual observation. Among the sophisticated stonework and massive temple pillars, they found tools, footprints, and carvings that suggested not only adults were involved in the construction, children had been there, not just observing, but building. The scale of the site was already baffling. Monumental architecture from 11,500 years ago, before agriculture, cities, or the wheel. But now, evidence pointed to the idea that children played an active role in its creation. Tool marks at lower heights, smaller handprints in the clay, and wear patterns in the stone all indicated the involvement of young people. This contradicted a core assumption of ancient labor that such projects required centralized authority, adult specialists, and a structured labor force. The image of prehistoric monument building didn't include children. Yet here was a different possibility, that early human communities built together, not just as necessity, but as expression. And that children, too, participated in shaping sacred space. The idea reframed how we think about ancient intelligence. Archaeology has often projected modern hierarchies onto the past, assuming that only adults led, only men carved, only specialists organized. But Göbekli Tepe tells a different story. A community story. One where learning happened by doing, where children weren't separated from culture, but immersed in it. Some of the carvings, animals, symbols, abstract forms, bore a level of innocence, of experimentation, as if young hands had traced figures into wet stone, not as workers, but as apprentices in meaning. And still the structures held, the pillars balanced, the temples endured. This wasn't primitive play, it was intergenerational craftsmanship. It also raises a profound question. What if the development of civilization wasn't sparked by necessity, but by imagination? What if it wasn't just survival that shaped us, but curiosity, wonder, and shared purpose? The presence of children at these sites speaks to a broader truth, that the capacity for innovation is not limited by age, that even in the earliest days of complex human society, we were already building not just for function, but for meaning, and that our ancestors may have known something we've forgotten, that the path to enduring culture runs through shared hands, young and old side by side. In the shadows of stone too old to name, we find the fingerprints of children, and they remind us that every great civilization begins not just with knowledge, but with play, learning, and a sense of belonging to something larger than the self. It was the silence between facts that finally began to speak. By now, the pattern is clear. A body survives Arctic cold far beyond known limits. A fish long extinct swims casually back into our awareness. Maps show continents no one had discovered. Ancient machines calculate the cosmos. Skulls reveal surgeries better than battlefield doctors centuries later. Each of these discoveries didn't just challenge the details, they challenged the structure of knowledge itself. We have long told the story of human progress as a ladder, step by step, from cave to skyscraper, from torchlight to satellites. But these findings suggest something different, something messier, not a climb, but a spiral. A cycle of discovery, loss, and rediscovery, where ancient knowledge doesn't always build in a straight line, but sometimes disappears entirely, only to be found again by accident. Why do we resist this idea? Perhaps because it humbles us, because it reveals how fragile our truths really are, built not only on evidence, but on what we've chosen to remember. Each of the 10 cases forces us to question the assumptions we've inherited. That extinction is final, that the ancients were ignorant, that progress is linear, that history is known. But maybe the most important thing these contradictions reveal is not about lost cities or buried machines. It's about us, our hunger for certainty, our discomfort with ambiguity, our tendency to turn theories into dogma and teaching into doctrine. What these discoveries offer isn't scandal or conspiracy, it's a deeper kind of mystery, the kind that invites awe, not fear. The kind that suggests the past is not closed, but still unfolding, still capable of surprising us, and still demanding our humility. The questions left behind are as important as the artifacts themselves. What else have we missed? What truths have we buried beneath layers of assumption? And how do we teach the next generation not just what we think we know, but how to wonder? In every ancient footprint, in every forgotten mechanism, there is a challenge, not just to history, but to imagination. And maybe that's the real contradiction, that in our effort to explain everything, we've left too little room for the unknown. But the unknown is where all discovery begins, and it is still out there, waiting. There's a quiet moment that comes at the end of a long journey, not a conclusion, but a pause. After walking through ice-bound sailors, ancient surgeons, underwater cities, and maps that defy time, a different question begins to emerge. Not what have we discovered, but how do we know what we know? The discoveries we've explored are not urban legends. They are real, peer-reviewed, excavated, examined. And yet many of them remain footnotes in the public record. Why? Because they don't fit. They don't slot neatly into the story we've told about ourselves, a story that insists on clarity, sequence, certainty, a story that often values control over complexity. But human history has never been neat. It's layered, like rock, compressed, like time, and occasionally it fractures in ways that let light in. The frozen sailor, the coelacanth, the skulls in Peru, they remind us that truth is not always found in consensus. Sometimes it's buried in the ground, or floating in the sea, or etched into forgotten machines. And the real lesson is not that the experts were wrong. It's that the process of learning is not static. It evolves. It stumbles. It gets humbled. That's the beauty of science and history when done well. They are not monuments. They are movements. They grow with us, fall with us, and rise again when new evidence invites a better question. This story, across all its chapters, has asked just one thing: to remember that certainty is not the same as truth. And that mystery is not the enemy of knowledge. It's its partner. We may never fully understand how ancient engineers built machines to track the stars, or why a tree believed extinct for 2 million years quietly endured in a canyon. But the fact that we're still finding such things should give us hope. Hope that we haven't learned everything. That wonder is still possible. So when we teach history, perhaps we should teach it with open hands, not as a sealed archive, but as a living question. When we look to the past, may we do so not with arrogance, but with listening, with the humility to admit that much of what we think is knowledge may, one day, be memory corrected. In a world drowning in data, perhaps the rarest thing we can preserve is curiosity, because the past is not done speaking. And if we listen closely, it may just tell us who we still have the potential to become.